Hey guys, this is Josh here with Trillium Wild Edibles, and today I wanted to show you a little bit about primitive paints and how to find rocks that make excellent paint. And depending on where you are, you're going to be finding some different colors. So let's roam this creek a little bit and find some of these rocks that we can make paint out of. First off, whenever you're looking for rocks that'll make paint or primitive paints, you want to find an area that has a lot of sedimentary rocks like this creek bed right here. Sedimentary rocks are basically made when you have a bunch of sediment that gets compressed together and then it hardens over time to form rocks. These are made up of different minerals, and this also provides the different color spectrums of the rocks that we're looking for. Where I'm at in this creek, for example, will have a whole lot of reds and yellows and even some whites. I used this creek bed probably about 6 to 8 months ago for a video that I did on finding natural clay for primitive bushcraft. So if you guys are interested, feel free to check out that video as well if you want to learn about some of that. However, this is an excellent creek bed for a lot of things. Something that's important to note is that the bedrock is very close. There's a lot of this shale bedrock right here in the creek, as you guys can see, and if we come over here and we look in the side of the mud of the creek bank, we can see this gray layer. This is some of the clay that's embedded in this dirt. There's a lot of clay here in this creek bed. So this tells me that this is an excellent area to be looking for rocks, for primitive paints. It's also a good place to be looking for clays, but it's also a good place to be painting for gold if you're interested in that as well. Where I live in Indiana, some of the gold flakes are very, very tiny, and that's beyond the subject of this video, but I did want to share that with you guys, that gold does exist within the Midwest. It's very, very tiny though. Now as we're walking through this creek bed, there's going to be a couple of things that we're looking for. Sedimentary rocks of color, and sedimentary rocks that are easily scratched with your thumbnail, because if you scratch them with your thumbnail, that means they're very, very soft rocks. And those are what we're looking for our paints. Okay, right here is a prime example of a sedimentary rock, and its color is obviously red. If we look very closely at it, we can see that the grains are very tightly compact. And if we scratch it with our fingernail, we can see that it very easily leaves some marks. So this tells us this is going to be a great rock for red primitive paints, or like an ochre style paint. On the other side of this rock, we see a little bit of yellow. So we might even get two colors out of this one rock, depending on which side or which part of the rock that we actually use. So we're going to hold on to this one, and we're going to look for some other colors. Right here is a prime example of another sedimentary rock that's yellow. And let's scratch it with our nail. Obviously, it leaves marks, so this is going to be another good candidate for primitive paints. This is going to give us a yellow color. Right here we have another really good example of kind of a clay. This is a type of clay. If I were to ground this up into fine dust, I could actually add water to this and have clay. But we can also use this to make paint, which will be kind of a whitish gray color of a paint. Here we have another one of these red and yellow rocks. This one is a much darker color, which will give us a little bit of a darker red, somewhat of a purple hue, but it still makes excellent paint. And whenever you mix two of these red rocks together, they might have some slightly different colors because they are naturally made, but they will generally be about the same color. This right here is a perfect example of a rock that we can use to test out some of these colors. And if you were in a situation like a primitive survival situation or just a survival situation and you needed to make some marks on trees to let people know where you've gone, using these can be a really good source to grind up some of these sedimentary rocks to get reds and whites and yellows, colors that will contrast easily in nature, to let them know where you've headed and where you've been and also where you've gone. So let's clean this guy off. Just kind of rub those rocks off of there. We don't need those. Now if I scratch this with my thumb, we can see that it doesn't leave really any marks. It does leave a couple of marks, but that's mainly because it's sanding off my thumbnail or filing down my thumbnail. It's not scratching into the rock. So we know that this rock is harder than the rocks that we've just collected to use for our paints. Now another really important step is to get some water on your hand and just kind of wash this rock off. Just kind of scrub it off and kind of rub it off really good. This will help to remove any dirt that might contaminate our colors or our paints. so that way we don't have too much of a different color than what we're going for. This also helps to add with the powder that we're going to grind these rocks into to make our actual paint. You can use a lot of things for that, from spit to milk to eggs to water, and it'll all work. Okay, I've washed this rock off really good and I've scrubbed it down really good. So now let's get some of our paints out, or some of our mineral rocks out, and let's scrape them up to see what colors we have. Alright, first up we're going to go with our yellow rock that we have right here. This is a beautiful color of yellow. We can tell most of the colors by just looking at the rock itself. So if you find a sedimentary rock that you can scrape easily with your thumbnail or your fingernail, and you like its color, you can use it for that color of primitive paints. Now these paints can be used for indoor crafts. You don't have to use them for a survival situation. You can use them to paint up things from war clubs to arrow shafts to bows to atlatls to atlatl darts. You can use these to paint almost anything that you want to paint up. I'm sure there are some surfaces that it won't adhere to. However, you can use these to paint up practically anything. So let's give this one a test. Now right here we can see the color of this yellow. This is a very nice yellow, and it's a very slick paint because we've ground it down to a very fine dust, and mixed with this water it feels kind of greasy and slimy, and that's exactly what we're going for. I'll give you guys a little bit of a close-up of this color so you can see some of its color and some of its texture. You can see it there on my skin. Very slippery, very slimy, but this does make an excellent paint, and it is a very beautiful yellow color. This rock, these yellows are excellent on wood. They also work really well on rocks and trees and things of that sort. So now let's take a look at our reds that we've gathered. Now right here we have the red that we have gathered. And right here you guys can see the color. Let's get a close-up of this so you guys can see it really well. Now this is the red that we've gathered. Your red ochres or your red primitive paints are going to be a rust color. They're going to be very dark. They're not going to be bright red. They're always very dark, generally no matter where you get them from. But it has the same texture and consistency basically as the yellow. Some of your rocks are going to be a little more gritty depending on what sediment they're comprised of. And I've noticed that in my area these reds are very, very fine. So whenever you grind them up into paint, they're very, very smooth and they paint absolutely beautifully. Okay, so now let's take a look at the white/gray that we found earlier. Now this is kind of a grayish yellow because of the color of the rock. This is a type of clay. You can tell whenever you feel it, whenever it gets wet, it feels just like clay because that's exactly what it is. Again, this is very slimy feeling in the hands. It's very slippery, but that's okay. This is a lot more slimy and slippery than our red, and both of these are a lot more slimy or slippery feeling than the yellow. And that's just because of the sediment. This is a rougher sedimentary rock. This is a little more finer, and this is extremely fine because it is clay. Okay, right here we have this somewhat flat yellow rock, and we're going to paint this one up with some of the reds because of the contrast is going to look awesome. Obviously, I'm not going for anything artistic in any way. This is just to show you guys how well this works and how good the contrasts can be depending on what you use these paints or ochres on. Right here I made just a quick and simple smiley face with my index finger. And you can make paintbrushes out of various natural objects as well to get finer colors. You can even use store-bought paintbrushes if you feel like using those. Now this has started to dry up a fair amount now, and that's all there really is whenever it comes to using rocks for primitive paint. You simply just want to grind your rocks down into a fine dust, and you can do this on concrete, you can do this on stones, you can even do it on some really hard woods, depending on what kind of wood you're trying to use. It's really easy to just use some water. You can also use, like I said, milk, you can use eggs, and you can even use your saliva. Some of the cave paintings were done by people putting some of these powders or these ochres in their mouths and then spitting it through a reed straw with their hand up against the cave walls. And that's what made that splattering effect that you see on some of the old Neolithic cave paintings. Right here on this rock, I painted a small arrow. I didn't do it on camera because my camera battery is about to die. But I wanted to show you guys that you can very easily paint a small arrow, and this only took me maybe about 3 minutes to do. And you would obviously want to make this a lot larger if you're trying to make yourself found, but it is a very good, useful tool if you need to get yourself found if you are lost out in the wilderness and you have a lot of sedimentary rocks that are brightly contrasting. Right here I have one of these things that's called Indian beads by local people, although it's actually a fossil. This is a crinoid fossil, and you can find a lot of these in the creek beds of Indiana. And I just painted this thing up red. These are called Indian beads because they do look like beads, and some of them have holes that are already pre-made through them, which is the internal part of the fossil or the crinoid organism. These exist because Indiana used to be covered by a whole lot of ocean millions of years ago, and this is the leftover remnants of these creatures. You can find these, especially if they have holes in them. You can then paint them up with ochres or mineral paints like I just did with this one, and then you can put a string through them and make yourself a primitive style necklace. So that's just one of the many uses of these primitive paints. And this right here is another and the last example that we're going to look at how you can use rocks for primitive paint. Now, this is a gunstock war club that I made. It's rather small in size, but it's very nice looking, at least in my opinion. You can see I've got white, red, and black, and I'd used rocks for this. Everything on this is primitive and naturally done. I've got a crystal-tipped agate point inside of it that I sealed up with pine pitch glue or pitch glue that I had made myself. So I thank all of you guys for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned something. If you want to learn more about wild edibles, medicinal plants, or even some primitive and bushcraft style things, please make sure to subscribe.